Before the monsters, before the blood, before the train became a prison, there was only a man and a phone screen. Choi Shin-soon had followed one forgotten web novel for more than 10 years. Not a famous masterpiece, not a hit series, a buried story with thousands of chapters and almost no audience. To everyone else, it was invisible. To Shin-soon, it was a lifeline. Every update carried him through loneliness, humiliation, military service, bad jobs, and the quiet fear that his life would never become anything more. Then the final chapter appeared. And the strangest part was not that the story ended. The strangest part was that, after reading it for a decade, Shin-soon still did not understand what the ending truly meant. Shin-soon did not think of himself as a protagonist. His life had no dramatic soundtrack. He was a contract employee, a commuter, a man whose hobby was easier to hide than explain. Yu Sanga was different. She studied on the train. She worked hard. She moved like someone who expected the future to respond if she prepared for it. Around her, Shin-soon became painfully aware of the distance between people who chase tomorrow and people who simply endure today. When she asked about his reading, he hesitated. How could he explain that his favorite story was a ruined world? How could he admit that a fictional apocalypse had comforted him more than his own reality? So he smiled, deflected, and wondered what genre his life belonged to. If life were fantasy, maybe he could be someone important. But in realism, he was only a reader. The quiet moment ended with a message from someone named TLS123. At first, it looked harmless. A thank you. A strange little note of gratitude. But the more Shin-soon read, the colder the carriage felt. The sender claimed the novel was complete because of him. They mentioned a competition. They mentioned monetization. They offered him a gift. And then, as if reality itself were preparing for a scheduled update, the novel disappeared from his library. Shin-soon stared at the empty space where 10 years of his life had been stored. A web novel vanishing should have been annoying. Instead, it felt like evidence. Somewhere beyond the screen, someone had closed the book. And now, at exactly 7 o'clock, something else was going to open. Then, the train convulsed. Metal screamed, lights snapped and flickered. People who had been complaining seconds ago were thrown into each other, grabbing seats, poles, strangers, anything that could keep them upright. A monstrous shape flashed through the chaos, too fast to understand and too real to dismiss. Shin-soon's first instinct was not heroism. It was Yu Sanga. He checked whether she was hurt, whether she could stand, whether the nightmare had already taken her. Then the clock changed. 7 p.m. A system announcement rolled over the carriage like a death sentence disguised as customer service. The free period was over. The main scenario was beginning. In that instant, Shin-soon understood. His life had changed genre. Not gradually, not symbolically. A small, horned being floated in the carriage, glowing as if it had stepped out of folklore and into fluorescent subway light. Some passengers laughed nervously. Some guessed it was an illusion. Some thought it was a prank, an augmented reality stunt, a promotional event gone wrong. Shin-soon did not laugh. He knew that creature. In the novel, beings like this did not arrive to comfort humanity. They arrived to open channels, announce trials, and turn suffering into spectacle. The passengers heard nonsense at first, words their minds could not process. But language was not the real barrier. The real barrier was belief. Humanity had spent its life assuming the world belonged to humans. The passengers did what ordinary people do when disaster strikes. They reached for authority. Police, government, military, news. A soldier named Lee Hyun-sung stepped forward, calm enough to make people listen, and honest enough to admit he did not have the answers they wanted. He had received emergency orders. A national disaster had been declared. But beyond that, the chain of command was cracking. Broadcasts spoke of attacks in Seoul. Political leaders were dead or under threat. The official language called it terrorism because the old world still needed old explanations. But Shin-soon knew better. Terrorism was too small a word. This was the first page of a new operating system for reality. Lee Hyun-sung's name struck Shin-soon like a hidden alarm. He was not just a soldier. He was someone from Ways of Survival, a supporting figure with a role Shin-soon remembered clearly. But there was a problem. Lee Hyun-sung was not supposed to be here yet. In the story Shin-soon read, His entrance happened later, after the first scenario had already reshaped the survivors. This meant the world was not replaying the novel perfectly. It was adapting, shifting, rewriting the order. Shinsun's advantage remained priceless, but now it came with a terrifying flaw. He had read the script, but the stage was improvising. Then the rules appeared. A blue interface opened in the air, cold and clean, as if murder could be formatted like a work assignment. The first scenario demanded proof. Within the time limit, the survivors had to take at least one life. If they succeeded, they would receive coins. If they failed, death would come for everyone inside the carriage. The difficulty rating looked almost insulting, as if the system considered the collapse of human morality to be beginner-level content. The passengers stared at the message, and for a few seconds, no one moved. That silence was more frightening than screaming, because every person in the carriage was doing the same calculation. If someone has to die, how do I make sure it is not me? Escape failed first. The doors would not open. A transparent barrier blocked access, as if the train had become a glass cage built by an invisible god. Calls to the police went nowhere. Passengers banged on exits, screamed for help, begged anyone outside to respond. But the system had already defined the carriage as a scenario zone, and until the scenario ended, nobody was leaving. Then came the crash from inside. Someone was attacked. A hand clamped over a mouth. Bodies recoiled. Blue particles drifted through the air like beautiful ash, making the horror look almost sacred. The enemy was no longer outside the train. The Dokebi offered a demonstration. Not mercy, not guidance, a service. A classroom appeared through a glitching projection. Desks, uniforms frightened students, and one name that would not leave the story quietly. Lee Jihai. The image trembled like corrupted footage, then the settlement began. Consequence fell faster than comprehension. Students were struck down in bursts of light and terror, turning the projection into a warning written in bodies. The survivors in the train could do nothing but watch. This was what the system meant by payment. This was what delay cost. And somewhere inside that blood-stained classroom, Lee Jihai stood like the survivor of a nightmare that had not finished explaining itself. Lee Jihai's introduction did not feel like an entrance. It felt like evidence. A classroom floor marked by violence. A student standing where innocence should have been. A screen breaking apart around her image, while the survivors struggled to understand what they were seeing. Then came the mocking presence behind the chaos. A voice that treated human terror like a joke and asked whether the spectacle was entertaining. Shinsun understood something important in that moment. The system was not only testing bodies, it was testing minds. Shame, fear, guilt, panic, betrayal, these were also weapons. And Lee Jihei had already survived something that could turn any ordinary person into a blade. Amid all the fear, there were signs the system was not only killing people, it was changing them. Blue lights appeared around survivors like fragments of a hidden interface. Electric force cracked through the carriage. Attempts to block or resist the scenario produced bursts of energy, dangerous enough to injure the living. Shinsun felt the phenomenon brush against him like a door half opening. It was not mastery, not yet. It was instinct, static, survival pressure taking shape. But in a world ruled by scenarios, even a spark could become a weapon. The question was whether Shinsun could learn fast enough before the system forced everyone else to evolve through violence. Then, a different authority made itself known. A horned, deceptively fluffy creature looked down on the survivors like a teacher already tired of disappointing students. It told them the generous days were over. Nothing would remain free forever. Manager Han, a man from the finance department, heard the language of value and made the mistake of thinking he understood the conversation. He offered money, business cards, promises, influence, everything that once worked in human society. The creature considered it, then explained the joke. Human money only mattered because humans agreed it did. Beyond their tiny slice of space-time, it was just processed fiber with a shared hallucination attached. Then the creature burned it, and Han's hands with it. The scream that followed did more than punish arrogance. It announced the death of the old economy. The channel opened. Blue blocks and holographic fragments shimmered around the carriage, and a new message arrived with a phrase that changed everything. The constellations had entered. The word sounded poetic until the meaning settled in. Viewers, sponsors, judges, Beings from beyond the human layer of reality were tuning in. The Dakebi and horned creature were not random monsters. They were hosts, brokers, enforcers of a broadcast where survival itself became content. The creature demanded an interesting story, then left the survivors with the first scenario ticking over their heads. Shinsun understood the cruelty now. It was not enough to live. In this world, you had to live in a way that someone powerful wanted to keep watching. Once the rules were known, every relationship inside the train changed. A stranger was no longer just a stranger. They were a possible threat, a possible sacrifice, a possible shield. Panic moved through the carriage like infection. Some people begged for reason. Some searched for loopholes. Some stared too long at the weak. The system had designed the first trial with disgusting elegance. It did not need to send a monster through the door. It only needed to trap ordinary people together and convince them that morality was a luxury with a time limit. Shinsun watched the transformation begin and felt the horrible pressure of knowledge. He knew the world's logic. He knew hesitation could kill them. But knowing the rules did not make them easier to obey. Shinsun had spent his life thinking of himself as a reader, a witness, someone outside the story, turning pages while heroes suffered and survived in another world. But the boundary was gone now. The ruined world had arrived, and the people around him were no longer background characters on his commute. Yu Sangda was beside him. Li Hyunsung stood as a fragile pillar of order. Li Jihei's mystery waited beyond the blood-stained classroom. The Dokebi watched, the constellations watched, and somewhere, perhaps, TLS 123 watched too. Shinsun was not the original protagonist of Ways of Survival. That role belonged to someone else. But Shinsun knew the epilogue. He knew fragments of the future. He knew that stories rewarded those who understood their structure. So as the first scenario tightened around the carriage, the quiet reader faced the impossible truth. If he wanted to live, he would have to stop reading from the outside and start changing the story from within.